ZAC has one of the best ways to sustain himself throughout anything that's thrown at him in all of League of Legends. Even considering that his spells cost a percentage of his current health, having Bloblets drop on every single ability hit anytime you hit any kind of enemy allows you to heal for tons and tons of your maximum health. Here I'm going to be going over the things that you should and shouldn't be doing throughout the 3 generic phases of a given game on ZAC to make sure that you're able to get the most out of him at basically every single point in the game. To find more on ZAC and other champions and even other topics in general related to League, make sure you check out our website where we have videos that are all done by challenger level players. But let's get back to this one and get started with our floppy slingshot boy. If you happen to learn something new throughout this video or have advice to drop, then by all means, please like the video, comment, tell everybody, new ZAC players, old ZAC players, share anything you know about the champion in the comments to make sure that you help everybody else out. And while you're at it, you should subscribe to make sure that you catch up with our other guides and any other videos that we happen to release on the patch or other tips that we can give you. But now let's jump right in, or should I say slingshot, into what ZAC has to offer you in the early game. One thing that you must not do, I repeat, must not do on ZAC is use a potion before the end of your clear. This is how you maximize the amount of health you have at the end of your clear on ZAC. You should never ever need to use a potion while you're clearing, even if you're doing a full clear until the very end. And the reason why is because your spells cost a percentage of your current health, while the passive pickup gives you a percentage of your maximum health. So you don't want to unnecessarily increase the cost of your abilities by raising your health with a health potion. This is a mistake that I see people make way too often, even in my games, and keep in mind, I'm playing in Grandmaster Challenger and Master MMR games. It's ridiculous that people don't understand this, but make sure you don't make the same mistake as they do. And while we're talking about optimizing the jungle clear and your health in general, don't forget to use your abilities on the right targets. When you're going onto Krugs, Raptors, or even Wolves, make sure you're actually hitting the big monster with your abilities like Q and E. Since these abilities have CC, it should be your goal to make sure that you hit as many things as possible, but don't sacrifice stopping the big monster, which usually contributes the most in any given camp. At the same time, you can also use your abilities to more effectively bridge the gap between camps, using your Q at the end of Wolves to latch on the blue buff and slap the big wolf together with the blue buff, or onto the Gromp as you transition onto it, making sure that you're doing them both at the same time, which is something you should look to do as often as possible on ZAC, as he can actually do Gromp and blue buff at the same time, assuming that you lead off with your Q to slap them so hard together that they kiss each other. And believe it or not, that is the real technique that ZAC employs with his Q. That's why people get stunned, because they're just surprised that actually just happened. In a similar vein, when you're trying to go for the scuttle crab, make sure that you land your E, or if you don't land your E, that there's a nearby honey fruit that you can latch onto your Q onto the scuttle crab with in order to break its resistances. Because ZAC's clear on the scuttle crab is absolutely pathetic if you don't manage to break it. With those health and time saving tips in the jungle out of the way specifically, your goal is to full clear in general to make sure that you're getting levels so that you can start ganking from really weird angles. But when you're actually going into the gank, what should your goal be? While just catapulting yourself in there and trying to hit your opponent might seem like a pretty good idea, eventually people aren't going to let that work and you're going to hit a little bit of a brick wall. But what you should be trying to do is creatively timing and aiming your E, either predicting people's movement abilities like a Lucian E or an Ezreal E, or even just timing going in on somebody in a lane as they go for a CS. And usually that's going to be one of the most reliable things you could do, especially on a cannon minion. People don't want to miss cannon minions. They give you a ton of gold, 70 plus gold, and if you miss that, you feel awful. And if you manage to make it so that you recognize when the opponent is going to step up and farm for the cannon, then you should time it so that you launch yourself at them. And they have a decision to make. They can go for the CS and pretty much die every single time, or they can flash away. And when somebody flashes away, uses a mobility tool or whatever, you still have the option of going after them with your Q. This is where things really start to open up really uniquely for ZAC. Even if somebody manages to avoid everything, if you position yourself properly and you manage to sort of cut off behind them with your E, so to speak, you can simply aim your Q at a nearby minion rather than trying to use the skill shot on them. And if you do that, then you can confirm the slap together by auto-attacking them, and that makes it literally unmissable. You can also aid yourself in doing this by having a blue smite, which can close the small gap that might be created by somebody using a small dash or a flash away from you in an angle that still puts them kinda near you. If they do manage to get really far away though, obviously you have to go for the Hail Mary and aim your Q. And if you land it, it can feel super satisfying to bring somebody further back in the lane, and dooming them assuming that your ally has fingers that work. At the same time, because all of this is possible, instead of trying to predict where somebody's going to go or aiming directly on top of them, you can simply choose to cut them off and make it so that you have the ability to aim your Q at a minion and auto attack them to CC them in a way that's actually meaningful if your E basically has no hopes of landing. ZAC almost always has a way to play into a gank, even if it means that you have to be a little bit creative and sort of purposefully miss your E. As you start to farm and gain levels in your E, you'll also be able to do this from more unique angles. You won't just have to gank from the river bushes or from the shallow places in the edges of the river, around the walls and that sort of thing. Now you could start coming from near blue buff, you could start coming from over Raptor's wall, or even over your Raptor's wall, because the range is actually that big. It pretty much reaches to the middle of the lane at max rank. This means that one of the most important things to playing ZAC in the early and middle stages of the game is playing around the enemy vision, because if you ever happen to notice that somebody places a ward somewhere, or you know for a fact that they place a control ward because you see it on the tab menu that they had one and now they don't, as long as you can make a pretty decent guess as to where their ward or control ward might be, you should be able to move in such a way that allows you to still pressure them and gank them without ever revealing yourself first. And these ganks can become even more impossible when you hit level 6, as your CC, damage, and survivability all spike up insanely hard once you get your ultimate. If you manage to land everything, ZAC can have nearly 3 full seconds of chain CC, and a large duration of it is knockups, which makes it really hard to reduce and avoid in the first place. ZAC might be a little bit of a slouch in the early levels in terms of his 1v1 potential, but at 6 that really starts to change, because your sustain gets improved, your overall damage gets improved, your mobility gets improved, and at the end of the day, you should be having relatively high enough stats that you can survive most run-ins with your passive, especially if an ally has TP to force you to survive when they TP to one of your bloblets. At this point, we're kind of bleeding into the mid game, and your main strategy should be to pick people off who are being extremely greedy in terms of where they're standing in lanes. Because of your ridiculous launch range on your E, you can very easily enter lanes from ridiculous angles and cover an insane amount of ground that just makes it near impossible for the enemy team to play where they want to. Usually, if the enemy is short range, this is just permanent doom, and the only time they ever have a chance is if they're long range champions who don't really ever have to walk up. A good example of this would be something like Xerath. He can be kinda hard for ZAC to get onto initially, but if you ever manage to catch him slipping even just a tiny bit, you can easily force out a flash or just straight up kill him pretty much on your own. With the amount of oppressive reach that you have in your own body flying towards your enemies at 3,000.5 miles an hour, you can usually get really good objective control. And while you are a tank and will need some help in order to speed things up, you can also take objectives solo because you have really good sustain and your W does a percentage health damage. Don't shy away from taking objectives, especially when you know the enemy jungler is on the opposite side of the map, as usually the only thing you're afraid of is somebody coming by and stealing it, as ZAC's kill secure on objectives is really poor compared to pretty much any other jungler. In the mid game especially, and when you transition into the late game, never forget that you do need to farm. You do actually need some relatively expensive tank items, and your reliance on those items for your insane survivability is definitely apparent, and you'll feel it if you ever neglect to farm and start losing out on golden experience. Because as you fall behind in levels and items, ZAC starts to feel really underwhelming because you get shredded when you don't have your abilities up in general. And so having this really nice engage that the enemy can then sort of negate and then just getting absolutely destroyed immediately afterwards feels really bad. And that's usually either from direct mistakes that allowed people to get fed, or you weren't farming and keeping up your resource gains properly, so you fell behind in levels, so your healing wasn't as good, your CC doesn't come up as often, and you also probably fell behind in items that made you take more damage or not have as much of a buffer before dying. You have really good AoE damage, so you should utilize it. You can really quickly take stuff like Raptors and Krugs and even Wolves Gromp in blue. Now you shouldn't be taking blue because you don't have mana, and while cooldown reduction on ZAC is nice, it's usually always better to give it to somebody like a mid laner or maybe an AD carry like Ezreal who really uses the cooldown reduction and stuff like Muramana. Now everything that I've told you is really nice, but there's something that really is a problem for ZAC when he tries to go in. Champions with displacements, hooks, knockups, and other really annoying CC that most importantly cancels his E. What do you do in situations where going in with your E is basically condemning you to death every single time? The answer is that you need to find flanks, or you act as a more traditional frontline and don't rely on your E to go in. And this means that you have to be really solid with your Q, and also a little bit dependent on your allies, let's be real here. Having stuff like Thresh, Janna, even to a certain extent Nautilus and Blitzcrank can really make it difficult for ZAC to go in without just immediately condemning himself to death, because you'll either be overextended, get your abilities interrupted so Aftershock and CC doesn't go through, or just plainly feel negated because you can't get in to do what you need to do at close range. Thresh is one of the best examples of somebody who can really make ZAC feel miserable. He has his E to shut down ZAC's E, and he can also use his Q if it's aimed well in an emergency. At the same time, when ZAC actually does get in, it can feel really frustrating to try and do anything because Thresh's ultimate box slows by so much that ZAC basically can't move anywhere, even though he's supposed to move faster when he hits R. Usually what ends up happening is that you're going in to try and pressure people to use cooldowns so that your team can then dominate, and that feels really bad. Instead, what you can try doing is playing on the front lines up against them in range and vision of them, where you can fish for Qs to pull people out and then chain your CC with your other abilities to pick off the people who are getting in your way. In the case of somebody like a Janna, who usually sits way further back than most other people, this might not be possible, but it's also worth saying that if a Janna is using her Tornado or even her ultimate to interrupt a ZAC going in, that's actually a pretty decent trade, as the cooldown difference there is relatively large. While we're talking about champions who are kind of countering your engage pattern in your E, it's also worth mentioning that there is some stuff that you can do to mitigate problems that you might have with your E during the game. If you cancel the channel by issuing a move command, you actually get refunded half the health cost and half the cooldown, which is pretty big, especially in the early game when the cooldown is 24 seconds at rank 1. If you notice that it's simply not the time to go in, then canceling it and waiting for another opportunity is usually very viable. And in the later stages of the game, when you start getting a bit more cooldown reduction and you're looking at closer to 10 seconds, the difference between 10 seconds and 5 seconds is still very massive. Not as massive as the amount of health that you're going to save by not inting and going in at the really wrong time, but still very noticeable. Similarly, there's a couple of unique interactions with ZAC Q that is really worth mentioning because you can get some really surprising CC off. If you happen to hit somebody with your Q and you don't have anything to sling them on, make sure you're looking out for the following things which you might not realize actually count. You can do it on turrets, you could do it on vision plants, blast cones, honey fruit, jungle monsters, a ward. Anything that you could target with an auto attack is fair game for smacking somebody with your Q. And this can lead to some really interesting stuff going on while you're looking at pushing towers and even doing tower dives. Having your sweeper active when you're in the middle of a fight in the jungle can also lead to you getting some really sneaky stuff done by spotting out enemy wards, and holding control wards in general can also be a good idea to help you do this as well. But now we've made it past the early, mid, and late game and also some of the generic skill tips, so the only thing left to do is to give you the runes and items that you're going to be looking for on ZAC. In terms of runes, you should be going Aftershock every single time. It is the best rune on ZAC by far, as it just gives him the resistances that he needs with his amazing health pool and regeneration to survive just about anything that is thrown at him, and even win some straight up one-on-ones. Because ZAC's health bar is really good when it's really large, you're kind of just incentivized to go for Font of Life, as you pretty much have CC on every single ability and even auto attacks in the early game with your red buff, allowing people to really easily proc the Font of Life on them. And while the numbers might seem not impressive, just keep in mind that it's extra on top of anything else that your allies happen to bring. Lifesteal, shielding, damage mitigation, and all that sort of thing, and these can add up and make somebody a lot more tanky than you might think. Also, let's be real here, ZAC has pretty much no use for shield bash, as there's really no way other than allies that he would ever get a shield, and in terms of tower damage, demolish, I mean, sure, you could kind of use it, but really, you're kind of going very greedy there and assuming that you're going to be in a winning spot more often than not, which might not always be the case. In terms of the second row, or third row depending on how you look at the runes, you do actually have two options here. You can go conditioning for better resistances, or you can go for second wind for those really clutch fights and general health regen. And I would recommend not going second wind if you're going to definitely buy a Warmogs or a Spirit Visage in the game that you're in, because at that point you're kind of dipping into the healing pool and passive healing too much, and you shouldn't really ever need it. It can be useful if you're going for fights relatively often and getting poked in the later stages, but that's what Warmogs is for, which is why you don't really need them both. As far as bone plating is concerned, it can be good, but in reality, the extra armor and resistances that you get later on in the game are really worth it from conditioning. And in most matchups, within the first 10 minutes, you really don't make use of bone plating as much as you might think. Then in the very last row, you have to make a tough decision. Overgrowth gives you bonus health, and ZAC wants just about as much health as he possibly can get because it amplifies his healing and also some of his damage. But in reality, having the Revitalize for the added healing and added healing when low allows ZAC to be insanely strong, especially in those really clutch situations where you start getting, below 40% health and you start getting that 10% increase. It starts to make a big difference over the amount of bloblets that you're picking up. And this can be even more apparent if the enemy team is often trying to engage on you and surprise you. Assuming that you hit one person with all of your abilities, you're picking up at least 5 of your bloblets pretty much every single time. Anytime you use your ulti, you can also pick them up even faster than you normally could. At that point, you're healing roughly 30% of your maximum health, and increasing just 1 or 2 of those by 10% can be absolutely insane for your survivability at low health. Lastly, in terms of secondary runes, there really is no better option than going Inspiration, as getting Cosmic Insight for more cooldown reduction and getting a free stopwatch from Perfect Timing really fits well into your items and what you are overall trying to accomplish on ZAC. In terms of minor runes, you have a couple options here. You could choose to go scaling CDR, which is a very, very good option, as not all of the items that you're going to buy as a tank and specifically as ZAC have CDR. So getting another 10% can be really, really nice as you scale through the game. And in the very, very late game, if you're trying to build perfectly around this, you will have 40% CDR by the time you hit a high level. ZAC doesn't really make use of adaptive force or attack speed that well, so having the CDR really is just better. And in the case of the rest of the runes, you probably should be going double armor, or if you notice that the enemy team really doesn't have a lot of damage in the early game, you could go armor and HP, which can matter for certain health breakpoints for stuff like Warmogs later on in the game if you're going it as your second item. And ZAC just kind of scales with health in general, so it's actually not a bad stat even when compared to the other resistances that you get. And speaking of those resistances, let's break out into the items now. And as your first starting item, you should be going a Hunter's Talisman every single time. ZAC has so much AoE and you can leverage the health regeneration so hard thanks to all of his abilities being really, really good in the jungle that it's just the obvious choice. And considering that you don't basic attack that much or have anything really going for you on basic attacks, Machete doesn't even compare. After that though, you should be looking to pick up a Blue Smite Cinderhulk because this is just the best thing by far for ZAC to get. It's health synergy, it gives him even more health as he builds more health items, it also gives him a slow to aid in landing any of his important abilities, catch up to people, CC them further in between cooldowns, burst people out who he's trying to burst combo before they can do anything about it. There's so much that this offers him, it's actually insane. And really, you might think that damage reduction from Red Smite is nice, but it really, truly pales in comparison to what Blue Smite can do on ZAC. After that, your boots should be a pretty obvious choice. You're looking for defensive boots, Tabby or Murtress depending on the enemy team. ZAC really doesn't benefit from having movement speed too much, so Swifties aren't really that great, and while you could make an argument for Lucidities, I really would avoid it, as the extra tankiness from either Tenacity and Magic Resist or Armor and Auto Attack Reduction is really insane. Afterwards, it's really up to you to decide what you need to deal with the enemy team. Like I mentioned earlier, depending on your setup, you can get some really, really nice breakpoints with a Warmogs as your second item, allowing you to hit the 3k health cap and be insanely ridiculous on repeat skirmishes. If you're looking for just more healing and survivability in general, Spear of Visage is the single standalone best item for keeping ZAC alive, even if you're going into not that much magic damage, because the amount of increased healing that he gets, combined especially with Revitalize and other effects throughout his kit and his allies as well, can make him ridiculous, even into the faces of multiple Grievous Wounds items. If you're looking for an armor option though, Knight's Vow would actually be a really good pickup as it provides good survivability and utility for your team, but if you're looking for something that's a bit more selfish, then a Randuin's would be more appropriate. The other honorable mention for the second item slot would be a Stone Plate, as it will give you really, really insane stats right off the bat, and you can double your health to make yourself really, really tanky as if you already had a Warmogs. Once you get your second item out of the way, it's just an endless battle of itemizing against what the enemy team has to offer. You're either buying some sort of magic resist item, an armor item, or a health item pretty much every single time. And you could have some really interesting purchases, like potentially a Liandry's if your team needs more damage, or if you're up against a lot of really, really high health enemies, but those are very rare and very far in between. That doesn't mean they aren't an option though, and it's something that you should absolutely keep in mind, because of course the best players at any given champion know exactly what to adapt to in every situation when they're playing. So now that you heard it here, make sure you consider when it might be right. A pretty solid example of a full build and build order on ZAC would be going Cinderhulk into Tabbies and then Stoneplate, following that up with a Spirit Visage into a Warmogs, and then maybe a Locket as a last item to provide a bunch of shielding to your allies. Always keep in mind that ZAC really doesn't have an issue surviving on his own 9 times out of 10, and being able to give survivability to your allies with insane health scalings and Stoneplate plus Warmogs combos is something that should not be ignored. That's everything that I can share on ZAC with you today, but to find even more on ZAC and other champions in general, make sure you go check out our website where we have guides that are all done by challenger level players. And don't let me get you confused. We don't have guides on just champions. We have generic guides, guides that focus on lanes, and even generic skills that everybody needs to have and understand in order to be really good at League. We're releasing tons of new content every day, so it's absolutely the best place to go for a constant stream of educational content to help you improve at League. And as always, my name is Ace Windstorm, and I will see you all later.